Picture this. I'm sitting in my grandfather's cabin sharing a cold beer with the state's attorney general when suddenly my front door explodes off its hinges. Wood fragments flying everywhere, the sound of expensive stilettos crunching through broken glass, and there she stands, our HOA president in her designer power suit, reeking of that aggressive perfume that probably costs more than my monthly pension check. She's screaming about property violations and community standards like she's conducting a military raid. This woman has zero idea she just barged in on the one person in America who could send her to federal prison. Zero clue her dramatic entrance is being live-streamed to thousands of followers who are about to witness her complete destruction. 8 months ago, I thought Margaret was just another power-hungry neighbor with too much time on her hands. Turns out she was orchestrating a multi-million-dollar fraud operation, and I was about to accidentally expose her entire criminal network. What would you do if some HOA dictator invaded your home during the most crucial meeting of your retirement? Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I bet half of you have your own horror stories about these neighborhood tyrants. Let me rewind and show you how this whole mess started. 8 months back, life felt pretty sweet. I'm Danny Mitchell, 54 years old, and after 3 decades of installing cable systems across rural counties, I'd finally earned my peaceful retirement. The centerpiece of my golden years was my grandfather's fishing retreat on Pine Ridge Lake, 3 acres of absolute paradise that Grandpa Joe snagged in 1961 for $1,200. Can you imagine? $1,200 for prime lakefront property that's worth more than most people's entire life savings today. This wasn't some flashy modern mansion, understand. We're talking hand-hewn timber construction, a fieldstone fireplace that Grandpa Joe assembled stone by stone with those weathered hands of his, and a wraparound deck that groaned in all the perfect places. I'd kept the whole place completely off the electrical grid by design, solar array humming peacefully overhead, well water that tasted like pure childhood nostalgia, and a waste management system that actually functioned better than the city infrastructure. Those early morning fog patterns drifting across the lake surface reminded me daily why Grandpa Joe selected this exact location. He always told me, "Danny, the land calls to you, you don't hunt for it." Wise old bird. He also warned me, when somebody wants your property real desperate, figure out their angle, because it's always worth more than they're admitting. Then the storm arrived. Margaret Blackwood, though everybody just knew her as that HOA maniac, descended on our quiet lakeside community like a hurricane dressed in business casual. 55 years old, freshly relocated from some gated community outside Phoenix where apparently terrorizing neighbors was considered a professional skill. She piloted this pristine white Suburban with custom plates reading "Boss." I'm not making this up. And she wore that HOA board member pin on her jacket like it was some kind of federal badge. The woman had a singular obsession: converting our rustic waterfront into what she termed a premium residential resort destination. But here's what escaped my notice initially. 4 elderly homeowner families had mysteriously sold their properties to anonymous cash buyers within 6 weeks of her arrival. Strange timing, wouldn't you say? Her opening assault came on a Wednesday morning. I'm relaxing on Grandpa Joe's deck, sipping my coffee and observing a family of herons teaching their offspring to fish, when I detect these sharp clicking noises on my wooden pier, designer heels, at 6:30 a.m. on my private property. 15 minutes later, she's attaching this official-looking document to my screen door. Violation notice. Unsightly waterfront structure negatively impacting community aesthetics. Fine, $750. Correction required within 48 hours, or escalating daily penalties will apply. I had to read the thing 3 times. My weathered boat dock, the identical one Grandpa Joe and I had reinforced together when I was 13, was apparently a neighborhood eyesore threatening everyone's property investments. Being a diplomatic guy, I walked over to clarify that my land actually predates their HOA by roughly 4 decades. You know what she said to me, standing right there in my own driveway with her hands planted on her hips like she owned the deed? "Every property owner around this lake reports to me, honey. Ask the Williamses how successful challenging me turned out for them." The Williamses, my elderly neighbors who'd inexplicably decided to downsize 6 weeks earlier after residing here for 27 years. The connections weren't forming yet, but something icy twisted in my gut. That's when she launched her photographic documentation campaign, circling my cabin like some kind of insurance investigator, capturing images of my solar installation, my vegetable garden, even Grandpa Joe's hand-carved deck railings. The synthetic vanilla scent wafting from that idling Suburban made me physically nauseous. By Friday, I'd accumulated 4 additional citations. Each one carried steeper financial penalties. Each one made it absolutely clear that Margaret Blackwood had declared total war on everything my family had constructed on this land. I assumed I was dealing with your standard power-tripping busybody. Irritating, certainly, but handleable. What I didn't understand was that I'd just painted a bullseye on my back in a game far more complex and dangerous than petty neighborhood politics. Grandpa Joe's advice echoed in my memory. Figure out their angle. I was about to discover their angle, and it would transform everything. Margaret didn't hesitate to deploy the heavy artillery, 5 days after my compliance deadline expired, because seriously, I wasn't demolishing Grandpa Joe's dock for some wannabe dictator. A certified legal document arrived that made my morning coffee taste like liquid stress. Cease and desist, violation of community waterway statutes. The letterhead proclaimed Sterling, Rodriguez and Partners, one of those elite law firms where the associates probably bill more per hour than I earned per week. The legal jargon essentially claimed my dock was illegally encroaching on community waters, and I owed $4,000 in retroactive penalty fees. Plus, they were threatening to place a lien against my property if I didn't pay within 7 business days. My initial reaction was pure panic. These people had attorneys. I had a toolbox and a stubborn streak. But then I recalled something Grandpa Joe had drilled into me during those long fishing expeditions. Danny, when someone's trying to lawyer you out of your land, the real facts are always buried in the county files. Never believe what they're selling you. Go dig up the actual documentation. So I drove to the county records office, that musty basement archive where all the critical information gets buried under layers of bureaucratic dust. The registrar, a kind woman named Dorothy who remembered Grandpa Joe from his tournament fishing days, helped me locate the original boundary surveys. I'd picked up this research technique from my union experience. Always examine the source documents before some suit tries to intimidate you with fancy letterhead. What I discovered made my blood pressure spike. Grandpa Joe's lot didn't just extend to the water line, it included 75 feet into the lake itself. The deed, officially stamped and recorded in 1961, was crystal clear. That dock wasn't trespassing on community property, it was positioned dead center in my personal lake territory. But here's the real bombshell. The HOA wasn't even established until 2001, 40 years after Grandpa Joe purchased his property. I remembered my old supervisor always explaining that older properties often possess rights that newer developments cannot override. Something about grandfathered privileges that supersede any neighborhood association. Nonsense. Armed with photocopies of everything, I returned to my cabin feeling pretty damn victorious. That confidence lasted exactly until I attempted to leave for grocery shopping and discovered Margaret's Suburban positioned horizontally across my driveway. Not alongside it, not near it, completely blocking it like she was operating some kind of personal traffic checkpoint. When I tapped on her window, she lowered it just enough to communicate through the gap. "Oh, Danny, I'm just reviewing the community parking regulations. This could take quite some time." The mechanical drone of her running engine combined with that cloying artificial fragrance created this bizarre atmosphere of passive-aggressive lunacy. Here I was, a grown man who'd installed half the county's telecommunications infrastructure, being held prisoner in my own driveway by a suburban control freak with a superiority complex. But Margaret was just warming up. Within days, she'd organized something called the Pine Ridge Aesthetics Council, which sounds reasonable until you realize it was basically an attack squad targeting anyone who didn't match her country club fantasy. Suddenly, neighbors who'd been friendly for years were avoiding eye contact when they saw me coming. Her social media posts were masterworks of passive-aggressive manipulation, concerned about certain properties affecting all our home values. Some residents just don't care about community pride. Chucker Pine Ridge strong, showing Chachker property values. The comment section transformed into a feeding frenzy. People I'd known for decades were suddenly legal experts, parroting Margaret's talking points like she was some kind of real estate prophet. 4 of my neighbors actually approached me privately to apologize. Rick and Linda Gonzalez pulled me aside during my evening walk and admitted that Margaret had strongly encouraged them to file complaints about my property or face their own citation bombardment. Apparently, she'd already targeted old Mr. Chen for having non-compliant flower planters and threatened the new family with twins over their unsightly playground equipment. "She's got dirt on everyone," Rick whispered, glancing around like Margaret might be lurking in the shadows with surveillance equipment. "Her husband has connections up at the state level, political connections, you know?" That hit me like a bucket of ice water. This wasn't just neighborhood drama anymore. This woman had influence beyond our little lake community. That night, I found fluorescent orange spray paint covering my mailbox. Bright, aggressive strokes spelling out comply or move. My security camera, solar-powered and concealed behind an oak tree, recorded everything, including Margaret's license plate as she drove away at 3:15 a.m. When I contacted the sheriff's department the following morning, guess who responded? Officer Brad Blackwood, Margaret's nephew. He examined the vandalism report, shrugged, and said, "Probably just teenagers. You know how kids are these days." The rough texture of that spray paint under my fingertips as I scrubbed it off felt like sandpaper against my sanity. Grandpa Joe used to say, "Sometimes you need heavier ammunition for a bigger battle. Time to find some heavier ammunition." Margaret's next strategy arrived disguised as community service, which somehow made it even more infuriating. She'd realized that direct confrontation wasn't producing results, so she decided to weaponize the entire county bureaucracy against me. It began with a courteous knock from Building Inspector Dale Morrison, a guy I'd actually collaborated with on multiple projects throughout my career. The uncomfortable expression on his face revealed everything before he spoke. "Danny, I'm really sorry about this, but we received a complaint about unpermitted construction on your property. You understand I have to investigate these reports." 4 hours later, Dale had examined every square inch of my cabin with his clipboard and measuring instruments. His verdict: everything was not only up to current code, but actually exceeded modern safety requirements. Grandpa Joe might have been old-fashioned, but he'd constructed things to endure. "Whoever submitted this complaint," Dale muttered while packing his equipment, "either has no idea what they're talking about or they're just trying to waste everybody's time." The next day delivered Environmental Inspector Janet Rodriguez investigating reports of my septic system contaminating the lake's ecosystem. Again, perfectly functional, better than most contemporary installations, she confirmed. Then Fire Chief Bob Martinez appeared to examine my solar panels for dangerous electrical code violations. Clean bill of health there as well. Each inspection cost me a day of peace and a piece of my retirement serenity. But more significantly, each false report was generating an official paper trail that portrayed me as some kind of problematic property owner. I remembered something my union representative used to caution us about. Bureaucratic harassment was a classic strategy because it appeared legitimate on paper, even when it was pure, vindictive persecution. While I was managing the inspection parade, Margaret was busy executing her media strategy. She'd managed to secure an interview with Channel 4's Community Concern segment, positioning herself as this devoted citizen fighting to preserve our family-oriented lake environment. The news piece was a masterpiece of manipulative editing. She displayed carefully angled photographs that made my cabin resemble some kind of backwoods shack, discussed hazardous conditions threatening children's safety, and portrayed herself as a courageous advocate standing against irresponsible property owners. What really ignited my fury was watching her stand on my dock, the one she claimed was illegally trespassing, while delivering her concerned citizen performance for the cameras. The sharp buzz of my phone with angry messages from neighbors who'd seen the story felt like automatic weapon fire. Half the lake community now believed I was some kind of environmental threat. But this is where Margaret made her first significant mistake. She got greedy. My old buddy Jake Gonzalez from the telecommunications union called me after viewing the news story. "Danny, that woman's completely full of it, and everybody knows it. You installed half the communications infrastructure in this county. Hell, your solar setup is what I use as a training example for new technicians." Within 48 hours, Jake had organized a convoy of my former colleagues to drive by and inspect my property. Turns out, having 25 certified technicians publicly endorse your work tends to demolish the hazardous installation narrative pretty effectively. That's when things started getting interesting. My attorney friend, Chuck Williams, we'd attended high school together, stopped by for a beer and mentioned something that caught my attention. "You know, Danny, the Attorney General's office has been investigating HOA fraud cases statewide, multiple communities reporting identical harassment patterns to what you're describing." "What kind of patterns?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "Elderly homeowners getting hit with bogus citations, property values artificially suppressed. Mysterious buyers appearing with cash offers. Sound familiar?" It rang every alarm bell I possessed. Chuck explained that these schemes typically involved someone with political connections providing protection, while the harassment campaign forced out longtime residents. The properties would then get sold to developers for enormous profits. "The AG's office is seeking witnesses," Chuck continued, "people who've documented the harassment and can demonstrate the pattern. Someone like you might be exactly what they need." The mechanical hum of my refrigerator seemed unnaturally loud as that information processed. Margaret wasn't just some power-drunk neighbor. She was potentially part of something much larger and more systematic. That night, I began a comprehensive record of every interaction, every citation, every inspection that had mysteriously appeared on my schedule. I also started investigating Margaret's background more thoroughly. Turns out her husband, Robert Blackwood, wasn't just some minor government employee. He was the county planning commissioner, a position that provided him access to zoning changes, development proposals, and political favors across multiple jurisdictions. The aroma of fresh coffee mixing with morning lake air usually relaxed me, but now it just reminded me how much I stood to lose. This wasn't about HOA regulations anymore. This was about whether I'd become the next victim in someone else's wealth-building scheme. Margaret's next phase made everything that came before look like a polite disagreement. She'd apparently decided that bureaucratic harassment wasn't moving quickly enough, so she escalated to full-scale character destruction. It started with a Facebook post that made my stomach drop. Urgent safety alert. Concerning aggressive behavior from lakefront resident. Please keep your families away from the North Shore area. We'll be seeking protective legal action. Pine Ridge Safety. Fi. Parent protect our children. Aggressive behavior. Me, the guy who'd helped coordinate the annual children's fishing tournament for 18 years straight. Within hours, that post had been shared 67 times. The comment section became a digital witch hunt of people who'd never even met me, all convinced I was some kind of dangerous psychopath based on Margaret's carefully constructed victim narrative. I always sensed something wrong with that man. Heard he made threats against a board member. Thank goodness we have brave people like Margaret protecting us. The really disturbing part, half these comments came from profiles with stock photos. The kind of fake accounts that political operatives use to manufacture public opinion. Margaret wasn't just spreading lies. She was conducting a professional disinformation campaign. 3 days later, she filed for a restraining order. The petition, which became public record, described me as an unstable individual making verbal threats against community leaders. Complete fiction, but it didn't matter. The filing alone became evidence that I was dangerous. Judge Patricia Williams, who actually knew my family from decades back, reviewed Margaret's evidence and dismissed the request for lack of credible documentation. But the damage was complete. Now, there was an official court document with my name and the word threats on it. The emotional toll was beginning to affect me. I'd sit on Grandpa Joe's deck in the evenings, nursing a beer and questioning whether this fight was worth destroying the peaceful retirement I'd worked 30 years to achieve. The familiar weight of his leather recliner felt different now, less like comfort, more like the burden of preserving a legacy that someone was systematically trying to erase. But just when I was considering surrender, something beautiful happened. The community began fighting back. Judge Williams wasn't the only one who remembered my family. Retired Judge Harold Hank Peterson, who used to fish with Grandpa Joe in the 80s, appeared at my door with a thermos of coffee and some unsolicited legal guidance. "Danny, that woman's playing a game your grandfather would have seen through immediately. She's counting on you feeling isolated and overwhelmed. Don't give her that satisfaction." Hank explained that documented harassment campaigns like this usually indicated larger criminal activity. People don't go to this much effort over petty neighborhood disputes. There's money involved here, serious money. The local American Legion Post, where I'd been a member for 18 years, issued a statement calling Margaret's accusations baseless attacks on a respected community member. The Historical Preservation Society added their voice, emphasizing my cabin's cultural significance as one of the few remaining original structures on the lake. Even the environmental monitoring group that tracked lake water quality praised my sustainable living practices. It felt like the entire decent portion of our community was rallying behind me. The bitter taste of stress was finally giving way to something that resembled hope. But Margaret wasn't finished. Not even close. Her next move was diabolical in its simplicity. She somehow convinced the power company to investigate irregularities in my electrical service. For 4 days, I had no electricity while they reviewed my solar grid connection for safety violations. Then came the false police reports. Suspicious activity at my cabin during broad daylight. Loud disturbances suggesting possible domestic violence when I was obviously alone. Possible drug trafficking based on unusual visitor patterns. Visitors who turned out to be union buddies stopping by to show support. Each call brought sheriff's deputies to my door. Each visit generated another incident report. Each report added to the growing file that portrayed me as a problematic resident. The most infuriating aspect was that Officer Brad Blackwood was typically the responding officer. He'd arrive, ask a few perfunctory questions, and leave with this smirk that indicated he knew exactly what his aunt was orchestrating. During one particularly surreal visit, he actually had the audacity to say, "You know, Mr. Mitchell, if you just apologized to my aunt and brought your property into compliance, all these problems would probably disappear." That's when I realized this wasn't just about me anymore. Margaret was demonstrating to other property owners what happened when you didn't submit. The Williamses, the elderly couple who'd mysteriously decided to sell, probably endured this exact same nightmare. The electronic chime of my phone became a source of anxiety instead of connection. Every notification could be another neighbor turning against me, another false report, another twist in Margaret's psychological warfare campaign. But it also brought messages of support from people I'd forgotten even knew me. The battle was far from over, but I was finally understanding the rules of the game. The breakthrough came while I was doing the most mundane thing imaginable, organizing paperwork for my meeting with the Attorney General's office. Chuck had arranged everything, explaining that they needed detailed documentation for their statewide HOA corruption investigation. I was sitting at Grandpa Joe's old pine table, surrounded by stacks of citations, inspection reports, and legal threats, when something caught my eye. One of Margaret's violation notices had this tiny footer I'd never noticed before. Fines payable to Pine Ridge Community Enhancement Fund, account .7399482, Community Enhancement Fund. That sounded official enough, but something about it bothered me. Maybe it was 30 years of reading telecommunications contracts and spotting the fine print that contractors use to exploit homeowners. But I decided to investigate further. The county clerk's office had become my second home by this point, so Dorothy knew exactly what I needed when I asked about HOA financial records. She pulled up the public filings and spread them across the counter like dealing cards. "Here's the situation, Danny," she said, adjusting her reading glasses. "Homeowner associations have to file annual reports just like any other organization. Let me show you what I discovered." The numbers didn't add up, not even close. Over the past 18 months, the HOA had collected $320,000 in emergency assessments for pier repairs that were never completed. Another $180,000 had supposedly gone to professional landscaping services provided by Blackwood Grounds and Maintenance, which according to state business records was owned by Margaret's brother-in-law. But here's the kicker. The landscaping company had been incorporated exactly 4 weeks after Margaret became HOA president. I remembered Grandpa Joe's advice about following the money trail. When someone creates a business right after gaining power, they're usually creating it to funnel money to themselves. The insurance claims were even more blatant. The HOA had filed for storm damage reimbursement 4 times in the past 2 years. Problem was, I'd lived through every storm on this lake, and none of them had caused the kind of damage that would justify $110,000 in insurance payouts. Dorothy helped me cross-reference the insurance claims with actual weather reports from the National Weather Service. The dates didn't match. The HOA was claiming storm damage on days when the weather had been perfectly clear. "Danny," Dorothy whispered, even though we were alone in the records room, "this looks like fraud. Plain and simple fraud." My hands were actually trembling as I photocopied everything. The smooth texture of those document pages felt like holding evidence that could change everything. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was organized theft from the entire lake community. The property management fees were the final piece of the puzzle. The HOA was paying $6,500 monthly to something called Lakeshore Property Management for administrative services. But when I looked up the business registration, the listed address was a P.O. box in the same zip code where Margaret lived. Everything clicked into place like a combination lock opening. Margaret's harassment campaign wasn't just about power or personal vindictiveness. She was systematically suppressing property values to enable a development scheme while simultaneously embezzling from the community fund. The elderly couples who'd sold their cabins hadn't just been harassed into leaving. They'd been forced to sell at below market prices because Margaret's artificial property value concerns had scared off legitimate buyers. Those mysterious cash buyers were probably connected to the same development group that was benefiting from the embezzled funds. I thought about the Williamses, probably stretching their savings in some cramped apartment, never knowing they'd been robbed twice. Once when they sold their dream home for pennies, and again through the fees they'd paid into Margaret's slush fund. The taste of black coffee had never been so bitter. This wasn't just about my cabin anymore. Margaret had been stealing from everyone, including the neighbors she'd convinced to turn against me. Grandpa Joe always said that when you discover corruption, it's usually bigger than you think. He was right. Margaret wasn't just running an HOA, she was running a criminal operation, and I was about to hand the evidence to the one person in the state who could shut it down permanently. That night, I converted Grandpa Joe's spare bedroom into something resembling a detective's investigation room. Maps of the lake properties covered the walls, showing original boundaries versus current HOA claims. Timeline charts tracking Margaret's harassment campaign alongside suspicious financial transactions. Photos, recordings, and documents organized by potential criminal charges. I felt like one of those TV investigators, except instead of hunting murderers, I was hunting suburban embezzlers. The Attorney General's office had assigned 2 prosecutors to my case, Sarah Chen and Michael Roberts, who arrived the next morning looking like they meant business. Sarah was this sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who reminded me of the quality control inspectors who used to keep us honest on job sites. Michael was younger, maybe mid-30s, but he had this quiet intensity that suggested he'd already sent plenty of white-collar criminals to prison. "Mr. Mitchell," Sarah said, spreading the financial documents across Grandpa Joe's dining table, "what you've uncovered here goes far beyond simple HOA harassment. This is systematic fraud that could affect dozens of families." Michael pulled out a tablet and started connecting dots I hadn't even seen. "We've been investigating similar schemes in 6 other counties. The pattern is always identical. Politically connected individuals use HOA positions to manipulate property values while embezzling community funds." That's when they told me about the FBI involvement. Agent Rebecca Martinez from the White Collar Crime Division had been tracking development fraud across the region. Apparently, my documentation was the missing piece that could tie together multiple ongoing investigations. The beauty of financial crimes, Agent Martinez explained during our video conference, is that everything leaves a paper trail. Your HOA records show classic money laundering, fake invoices, shell companies, insurance fraud. But we need more than just documents. We need witnesses and recorded evidence of ongoing criminal activity. Chuck, my lawyer friend, had been working behind the scenes too. He'd connected with 19 other lakefront families who'd experienced similar harassment. When we gathered them at the Legion Hall, their stories painted a picture that made my blood boil. The Johnsons had paid $9,500 in bogus violation fines before selling their cabin for 35% below market value. The Rodriguezes had been hit with emergency assessments totaling $14,000 for lake improvements that never materialized. Old Mrs. Kim had been so intimidated by Margaret's legal threats that she'd moved in with her son in Denver, abandoning the home where she'd lived for 38 years. Every story followed the same script: escalating harassment, manufactured violations, pressure to sell, and every family had contributed to that community enhancement fund that was really just Margaret's personal bank account. Here's what most people don't understand about HOA fraud, explained retired CPA Frank Weber, who'd volunteered to help analyze the financial records. Homeowner associations are required to file Form 1120 tax returns annually if they meet certain income thresholds. Legitimate organizations file religiously. Corrupt ones usually don't, because honest accounting would expose their theft. Frank had discovered that our HOA hadn't filed proper tax returns in over 3 years, despite collecting hundreds of thousands in fees and assessments. That single fact could trigger federal tax evasion charges on top of everything else. The strategy session felt like planning a military operation. We had financial evidence, witness testimony, recorded harassment, and documented fraud. But Agent Martinez wanted something bigger. She wanted to catch Margaret in the act of actively committing crimes. The best way to build an airtight case, she explained, is to create a situation where the suspect's criminal behavior is captured by law enforcement in real time. We need her to incriminate herself on camera. That's when Chuck suggested the perfect setup. The Attorney General has been looking for an opportunity to announce new HOA reform legislation. What if she held that announcement at Danny's cabin? It's symbolically perfect, protecting homeowner rights in the exact location where those rights were violated. Sarah's eyes lit up. And if Margaret's pattern holds, she'll absolutely try to disrupt any suspicious activity at Danny's property. Her need to control the situation will override her common sense. We spent the next week preparing for what Agent Martinez called a controlled confrontation scenario. Professional recording equipment hidden throughout my cabin. Undercover officers positioned around the lake. Multiple law enforcement agencies coordinated for rapid response. The community coalition had grown too. Local media was alerted to potential breaking news. Social media campaigns were ready to counter any false narratives Margaret might try to spin. Support networks were activated for the post-confrontation period. My old union training kicked in. When you're planning a complex installation, you prepare for every possible scenario and always have backup systems. We had backup plans for the backup plans. The trap was set. Margaret's pattern of behavior was so predictable that we could practically script her next move. All we had to do was wait for her to kick down the door. Literally. Margaret must have sensed the walls closing in because her behavior shifted from calculated harassment to complete sabotage. It was like watching a cornered animal lash out in every direction, becoming more dangerous as her options disappeared. The first sign was my solar panels mysteriously malfunctioning on a Thursday morning. I'd wake up to dead batteries and error codes flashing on the inverter display. When my technician buddy Jake came out to investigate, he found clear evidence of tampering. Wire connections loosened just enough to disrupt the system without causing obvious damage. "Danny, this is professional-level sabotage," Jake said, photographing the evidence with his phone. "Whoever did this understands electrical systems. They wanted to cause problems without leaving obvious fingerprints." But Jake was smarter than Margaret gave him credit for. He'd installed a hidden security camera near the electrical panel after the first incident. 3 nights later, we caught her red-handed, creeping around my property at 2:45 a.m. with a screwdriver and wire cutters. The footage was crystal clear. Margaret Blackwood, HOA president and upstanding community member, vandalizing private property under cover of darkness. The acrid smell of her cigarette smoke lingered in the morning air, mixing with the pine scent that usually made me feel peaceful. Next came my boat dock. I'd gone into town for supplies and returned to find my boat drifting halfway across the lake. The heavy-duty chains I'd used to secure it had been cut with bolt cutters, clean, deliberate cuts that left metal shavings scattered across the dock planks. That boat had been Grandpa Joe's pride and joy, a 1976 bass boat that still ran like a dream. Finding it bumping against the opposite shore, its hull scratched from the rocks, felt like someone had vandalized his grave. But Margaret's biggest mistake was targeting my septic system. I just passed a county inspection with flying colors, but suddenly my perfectly functioning system started backing up. The smell was horrific, that combination of sewage and chemical additives that made your eyes water from 100 feet away. When the emergency septic service arrived, they found industrial-grade drain cleaner had been poured down my system, killing all the beneficial bacteria and creating a toxic mess. "This is deliberate sabotage," the technician explained, holding up soil samples that showed chemical contamination. "Someone pumped commercial-grade acids into your system. This stuff costs serious money and requires specialized knowledge to use." The repair bill was $3,800. But more importantly, the chemical analysis provided forensic evidence that this wasn't random vandalism. It was calculated destruction requiring insider knowledge of septic systems. While I was dealing with sewage backup, Margaret was orchestrating her media blitz. Anonymous accounts flooded social media with posts about my ongoing property violations and deteriorating conditions threatening neighborhood safety. The bot accounts were so obvious it was almost comical. Dozens of profiles with generic names posting identical complaints within minutes of each other. She'd also ramped up the intimidation network. Officer Brad Blackwood's patrol presence increased dramatically. He'd cruise by my cabin 5 or 6 times per day, always slowing down just enough to make his surveillance obvious. Sometimes he'd sit in my driveway for 30 minutes, running license plates of anyone who visited. The building inspector suddenly found code violations in work that had passed inspection just weeks before. The fire marshal received anonymous tips about fire hazards that didn't exist. Environmental Services got reports about illegal dumping in areas of my property they'd already cleared. It was death by 1,000 cuts designed to exhaust my resources and break my spirit through bureaucratic warfare. But I wasn't the only target anymore. Margaret had started going after my supporters too. Jake's contracting license was suddenly under review for safety violations. Hank Peterson, the retired judge who'd been advising me, received a formal complaint with the State Bar Association about improper legal counsel to non-clients. The American Legion Post found themselves facing a surprise fire safety inspection that threatened to shut down their weekly bingo nights. The Historical Preservation Society was hit with zoning complaints about their downtown office space. Margaret was systematically attacking anyone who'd shown me support, sending a clear message: "Help Danny Mitchell and you'll become our next target." The psychological pressure was intense. Every morning brought new crises, new emergencies, new bureaucratic nightmares to navigate. The metallic taste of constant stress became as familiar as my morning coffee. But Margaret's desperation was also creating opportunities. Each escalation was being documented by law enforcement. Every act of sabotage provided additional criminal evidence. Her network of supporters was starting to distance themselves as her behavior became increasingly unhinged. The Attorney General's office was watching everything, building an airtight case while Margaret dug her hole deeper with every vengeful act. Agent Martinez called it textbook criminal escalation. When perpetrators feel cornered, they often make increasingly reckless decisions that provide prosecutors with the evidence they need for conviction. Margaret was walking straight into our trap, one sabotage solar panel at a time. Margaret's final gambit was so audacious it almost worked. She'd figured out through her husband's political connections that I wasn't just meeting with some random state official, I was meeting with Attorney General Patricia Williams herself. And instead of backing down, Margaret decided to go nuclear. Her plan was brilliant in its twisted logic. She would position herself as the victim of a political conspiracy, claiming that the state's top prosecutor was targeting her family for partisan reasons. If she could record herself confronting government corruption at my cabin, she could flip the entire narrative and paint herself as a brave whistleblower standing up to abuse of power. The first sign of her new strategy came through social media. She'd reached out to Citizens Against Government Overreach, one of those blogger networks that amplifies stories about bureaucratic persecution. Her pitch was perfect. Small-town HOA president being persecuted by big government because her husband worked for the opposing political party. Local family under attack. State officials use harassment investigation to silence political opposition, was the headline that started circulating 5 days before my scheduled meeting. The story painted me as some kind of deep state operative working with corrupt prosecutors to destroy an innocent family. The comment section was flooded with outrage from people who'd never heard of our lake community but were absolutely convinced that Margaret was being railroaded by partisan prosecutors. She'd tapped into that vein of anti-government sentiment that runs through rural communities, turning herself into a martyr for political persecution. But Margaret's masterstroke was the live stream setup. She'd arranged to broadcast her confrontation with the Attorney General live on social media, framing it as citizen journalism exposing government corruption in real time. Her plan was to burst into my cabin during the meeting, record everything, and let her followers spread the footage as proof of official misconduct. What she didn't know was that we were monitoring her communications. Agent Martinez had obtained warrants for Margaret's phone and social media accounts weeks earlier. We knew about the blogger outreach, the livestream plan, even the talking points she'd prepared for her spontaneous confrontation. "It's actually perfect," Agent Martinez explained during our final coordination meeting. "She's going to commit multiple felonies on live video while providing us with a real-time confession of her motives. We couldn't have scripted it better." The irony was delicious. Margaret thought she was setting a trap for us, but she was actually walking into the most thoroughly documented arrest in HOA history. Her support network was crumbling too, but she was too obsessed to notice. The other HOA board members had quietly distanced themselves once the financial irregularities became obvious. Her husband was facing his own ethics investigation and couldn't provide political cover anymore. Even Officer Brad had been reassigned to different patrol areas after Internal Affairs started asking questions about his response to vandalism reports. But Margaret was beyond rational thinking at this point. The psychological pressure of keeping her fraud scheme hidden while fighting off multiple investigations had pushed her past the breaking point. She was exhibiting all the classic signs of someone losing control: paranoid about neighbors spying on her, making increasingly threatening phone calls to anyone who'd supported me, convinced that everyone was part of some vast conspiracy against her. The night before the Attorney General's visit, she made threatening calls to 6 different families, warning them about consequences if they continued collaborating with government harassment. Each call was recorded by law enforcement. Each one provided additional evidence of witness intimidation and criminal conspiracy. I spent that final evening sitting on Grandpa Joe's deck, watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and crimson. The sound of loons calling to each other across the water reminded me why this place was worth fighting for. Tomorrow would determine whether I'd be able to enjoy peaceful evenings like this for the rest of my retirement, or whether I'd spend my golden years battling Margaret's appeals from federal prison. The cabin felt different that night, not just because of the hidden cameras and recording equipment, but because it had become the center of something much bigger than my personal property dispute. This was about whether small-time criminals with political connections could terrorize entire communities without consequences. I pulled out Grandpa Joe's worn leather journal and read the passage he'd underlined about David facing Goliath. He'd written in the margin, "Sometimes the little guy wins because he's fighting for something bigger than himself." The morning would bring Margaret's final desperate gambit. She'd storm through that door thinking she was about to destroy her enemies, never realizing she was about to destroy herself. The stage was set. The cameras were rolling. Law enforcement was in position. All we had to do was wait for Margaret to provide the grand finale to her own criminal career. The taste of anticipation mixed with morning coffee had never been so sweet. Attorney General Patricia Williams was nothing like I'd expected. Instead of some intimidating political figure, she was this down-to-earth woman in her 50s who reminded me of my old high school principal, tough but fair, with eyes that missed nothing. She'd arrived at my cabin at exactly 9 a.m., carrying a thermos of coffee and a briefcase full of evidence that would change everything. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, settling into Grandpa Joe's old recliner like she belonged there, "your documentation has helped us build cases against HOA corruption rings in 7 counties. What you've uncovered here isn't just local fraud. It's part of a statewide pattern of organized theft." We were deep in discussion about the criminal charges when we heard it. The distinctive roar of Margaret's Suburban pulling into my driveway way too fast, gravel spraying everywhere like she was conducting some kind of high-speed chase, car doors slammed, multiple voices shouting instructions about camera angles and audio levels. Margaret had brought her entire social media production crew for what she thought would be her moment of triumph. "Here we go," Agent Martinez whispered into her earpiece from her hidden position behind my tool shed. Attorney General Williams didn't even flinch. She just calmly continued taking notes about the financial evidence while Margaret's voice got louder, working herself up into righteous fury for her livestream audience. "This is it, folks," Margaret's voice carried clearly through my windows. "We're about to expose the corruption that's been targeting our family. The state's Attorney General is illegally meeting with our harasser, probably planning more government persecution." The sound of her designer heels clicking aggressively across my wooden deck was like a countdown timer to disaster, her disaster, not mine. Crash! The door exploded inward like she'd used a battering ram instead of her foot. Wood splintered everywhere. The Attorney General's coffee mug hit the floor with a ceramic crash that punctuated the moment perfectly. Margaret stormed into my living room with her phone held high, live streaming everything, completely oblivious to the fact that she'd just committed criminal trespass, breaking and entering, and assault in front of the state's chief prosecutor. "I demand to know why the Attorney General is secretly meeting with this man," she screamed, waving her phone around like it was some kind of weapon. "This is government harassment. Political persecution. I have rights. The look on her face when Attorney General Williams calmly stood up and displayed her official identification was absolutely priceless. Margaret's livestream captured the exact moment when her brain processed what had just happened. Total frozen terror. "Mrs. Blackwood," the Attorney General said in that calm, professional tone that probably made hardened criminals wet themselves, "I am Patricia Williams, Attorney General of this state. You have just committed multiple felonies in my presence, and your entire criminal performance is being recorded by both my office and your own social media broadcast." Margaret's phone was still live streaming. Her followers were watching in real time as their heroic whistleblower turned into a babbling, incoherent mess. The comment section exploded with confusion and disbelief as people realized they'd been supporting a criminal who'd just self-destructed on camera. This is my community, I have jurisdiction here," Margaret stammered, still somehow thinking her HOA badge gave her authority over state prosecutors. That's when FBI agent Martinez stepped through my still-open doorway, flanked by 3 other federal agents. "Mrs. Blackwood, you're under arrest for fraud, extortion, witness intimidation, and criminal harassment. And thanks to your live stream, we have your confession broadcast to about 4,500 witnesses." The sound of handcuffs clicking shut echoed through my cabin like the closing of a book. Margaret's phone clattered to the floor, still streaming her arrest to an audience that had shrunk from outraged supporters to horrified voyeurs watching a public meltdown. "Margaret," I said, standing up from Grandpa Joe's couch with a satisfied smile, "meet the state's Attorney General. She's been wanting to discuss your bookkeeping methods." The neighbors who'd been drawn by the commotion stood on my deck, watching in stunned silence as the woman who'd terrorized our community for months was read her Miranda rights in my living room. Mrs. Kim, who'd driven down from her son's place specifically for this moment, had tears streaming down her face. Sheriff Rodriguez arrived just in time for the perp walk, Margaret stumbling in handcuffs past the same dock she'd tried to have demolished, past the same solar panels she'd claimed were hazardous, past the same cabin she'd called an eyesore. The pristine white Suburban with its Boss 1 vanity plates was towed away as evidence in the fraud case. The live stream ended with Margaret's voice echoing across the lake. "This isn't over. My husband will fix this. You don't know who you're dealing with." Actually, Margaret, we knew exactly who we were dealing with. A criminal, and criminals go to prison. Watching Margaret get sentenced 4 months later felt like Christmas morning. Federal Judge Michael Harrison didn't just throw the book at her, he launched the entire law library. 4 years in federal prison, $380,000 in restitution to defrauded homeowners, and a lifetime ban from serving on any HOA board in the United States. Her husband Robert wasn't far behind. The ethics investigation revealed he'd been using his position as county planning commissioner to provide insider information about zoning changes and development plans. He resigned in disgrace and got 2 years for conspiracy and abuse of office. The HOA itself was dissolved faster than sugar in hot coffee. In its place, we formed the Pine Ridge Lake Volunteer Association, emphasis on volunteer. No mandatory fees, no citation authority, no power-drunk presidents. Just neighbors working together to keep our little slice of paradise beautiful. My role in exposing the corruption scheme earned me something I never expected: whistleblower compensation from the recovered fraud funds. Turns out, when you help the feds recover hundreds of thousands in stolen money, they're pretty generous with the rewards. That check for $52,000 felt like vindication for every sleepless night Margaret had caused me. But the real victory was watching justice ripple outward. Attorney General Williams used our case as the foundation for new state legislation that I still can't believe has my name on it. The Mitchell Act requires all HOAs to undergo annual independent financial audits and creates criminal penalties for harassment-based property manipulation schemes. 4 other counties used our evidence to prosecute similar fraud rings. Turns out Margaret's operation was part of a much larger network of politically connected criminals systematically robbing homeowners across rural communities. The FBI's final report identified over 30 related cases spanning 6 states. The families who'd been driven from their homes started coming back too. The Williamses bought a beautiful new cabin 3 lots down from mine after their old property's fraudulent value concerns were legally voided. Mrs. Kim moved back from Denver and threw a block party that lasted until sunrise. Property values didn't just recover, they soared. Turns out, when you remove the constant threat of harassment and fraudulent citations, people actually want to live in a peaceful lakefront community. Who would have thought? The transformation went beyond legal victories. Our little lake became a model for sustainable community living. My off-grid cabin, once Margaret's target for eyesore citations, now hosts monthly tours for people interested in solar power and environmental stewardship. The State Environmental Agency featured us in their Renewable Energy Showcase program. I established the Grandpa Joe Legacy Scholarship using part of my whistleblower compensation, $750 grants for kids entering technical training programs. Grandpa Joe always believed that working with your hands was the foundation of an honest life. It seemed fitting to help the next generation learn those same values. The annual Pine Ridge Lake Festival has become a regional attraction, raising money for veterans' housing assistance programs. Last year, we brought in enough to fund 4 tiny home projects for homeless vets. The sweet smell of barbecue and the sound of families laughing together replaced the toxic atmosphere Margaret had created. But the best part? The quiet moments. I'm sitting on Grandpa Joe's deck right now, watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and purple. The loons are calling to each other across the water, their voices echoing off the same hills where Grandpa Joe taught me to fish 50 years ago. My solar panels hum peacefully on the roof, powering a life that's finally my own again. No more certified letters, no more inspection visits, no more designer heels clicking across my dock at dawn. Just the gentle lap of waves against weathered wood and the knowledge that sometimes, if you're stubborn enough and righteous enough, David really can beat Goliath. The documentary crew from Hulu finished filming here last month. HOA Hell, How One Retiree Took Down a Criminal Empire premieres this spring. They paid me enough to add a guest cabin where other harassment victims can stay while fighting their own battles. Because Margaret wasn't unique, there are power-drunk HOA dictators in communities across America, terrorizing elderly homeowners and stealing from community funds. But now there's a roadmap for fighting back. Now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment sharing your own HOA nightmare. Trust me, you're not alone in this fight. These stories need to be told. Hit subscribe if you want more stories about everyday people taking down corrupt systems, because there's a lot more where this came from. Next week, I'm telling you about the city councilwoman who tried to shut down a veteran's food truck until the owner's Marine buddies decided to pay a visit. Thanks for hanging out with us on HOA Chronicles, where the HOA Karens meet their match. If this story had you cheering or cringing, go ahead and like the video, drop a comment with your reaction, and hit subscribe so you're ready for the next wild HOA tale.